The hymnals were still warm. On the evening of October 11, 1970, in the river town of Madison, Indiana, population 13,100, the First Methodist Church on West Street had just closed its Sunday doors. The last of the congregation had filed out into the autumn air, that particular October cold that carries the smell of wood smoke and river mud and wet leaves pressed flat against the sidewalk. At 7:14 p.m., the church custodian, a retired schoolteacher named Earl Pruitt, had watched Dorothy Wainwright button her coat at the top of the front steps, wave to the two women walking ahead of her down Mulberry Street, and turn south toward the river. He never saw her reach the corner. What happened to Dorothy Wainwright in the darkness between West Street and the Ohio River would remain unanswered for 54 years. And the person responsible for it had, in all that time, never left Madison. To understand what was taken on that October evening, you first have to understand who Dorothy Wainwright was. She had been born in Madison in 1931, the daughter of a hardware store owner who sold bolts and pipe fittings from a narrow shop on Main Cross Street that smelled of oil and sawdust and metal. She had grown up 2 blocks from the Ohio River, close enough to hear the towboats at night, and she had never once seriously considered living anywhere else. Madison was her world in the particular way that small river towns become worlds unto themselves, contained, layered, every family's story wound through every other family's story like thread through a loom. Dorothy was 39 years old in the fall of 1970. She taught 4th grade at Madison Consolidated Elementary, had done so for 11 years, and was known in the school as the teacher children requested by name. She taught arithmetic with dominoes and geography, with hand-drawn maps she made herself on Sunday afternoons. Her classroom had a shelf of library books that students could borrow over weekends, a practice the principal had once questioned and then quietly stopped questioning when parents kept writing to say their children had started reading at home. She lived alone in a 2-story white house on Elm Street that had been her parents' house. Her mother had died in 1964. Her father in 1967. She had one brother, Gerald, who had moved to Indianapolis after the Korean War and came back to Madison twice a year, Thanksgiving and the 4th of July, and who said, later, that he had never once worried about Dorothy, because Dorothy was the kind of person who made you feel like everything was going to be fine even when you knew it probably wasn't. She sang in the church choir. She was partial to lemon cake. She kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that she tended with the same methodical attention she brought to her classroom. She was, by every account, the kind of woman that a town leans on without quite knowing it is doing so. The kind of person whose absence, when it comes, reveals a structural weight that nobody had ever stopped to measure. She had been seen in good spirits at the Sunday service. She had stayed to help stack the hymnals after the final song. She had told the choir director she would see him the following Wednesday at rehearsal. That was the last time anyone who knew Dorothy Wainwright spoke to her. By 8 o'clock that Sunday evening, Dorothy had not arrived home. By 9, her neighbor, a widow named Ruth Cassidy, who lived directly across Elm Street, had noticed the house still dark and called Gerald in Indianapolis. Gerald told her Dorothy sometimes stayed late when the choir ran long. Ruth said she knew, but something felt wrong. She called the Madison Police Department at 9:22 p.m. The responding officers reached Elm Street at 9:31 and confirmed the house was empty and locked. They retraced the route between the church and Dorothy's home, a 7-minute walk along streets that half the congregation had taken that same evening without incident. On the narrow gravel path that ran between a fence line and the back of the old Taggart Grain Company building on 2nd Street, Officer Dale Colvin found Dorothy Wainwright's black leather handbag. The clasp was fastened. Her house key was inside. Her choir folder was inside. Her reading glasses were inside. Nothing had been taken. Dorothy was not there. The investigation that opened the following morning was led by Chief of Detectives Warren Klein, a methodical and respected figure who had worked Madison cases for 16 years and who treated Dorothy Wainwright's disappearance from the first hour as what he believed it to be, not a missing person, but a homicide without a body. The grain company path ran between a working fence and a drop of approximately 4 meters to a gravel service road below. Tire impressions in the soft gravel of the service road, partially degraded by the overnight moisture from the river, suggested a vehicle had been parked there sometime in the hours around the disappearance. A door-to-door canvass of the surrounding blocks over the following 3 days produced 6 residents who reported hearing something between 7:15 and 7:45 that Sunday evening. The descriptions varied. 2 said it sounded like an argument. 1 said a car door slamming. 1 said nothing more specific than that something had felt wrong enough to make her get up and look out the window, and that by the time she looked, the street was empty. Dorothy Wainwright's body was found 11 days later, on October 22, 1970, by a towboat crew working the Ohio River bank approximately 3 miles downstream from Madison. She had been in the water. The circumstances of her death were confirmed by the Jefferson County coroner. She had been strangled. She was 39 years old. Chief Klein and his 2 detectives worked the case through the winter of 1970 and into the spring of 1971. The grain company path, they determined, was a shortcut that would have been known to anyone who had lived in Madison for more than a few years. Dorothy almost certainly used it regularly on her walk home from church. It saved 4 minutes over the main road route, and she was a practical woman who noticed things like that. Which meant whoever had been waiting on that service road below the fence had known her route, had known her habits, had been there on purpose. A name surfaced early. Raymond Alcott was 34 years old in 1970. A mechanic who operated a garage on Michigan Street, 3 blocks from Dorothy's house. He was unmarried, had lived in Madison his entire life, and had attended First Methodist intermittently for several years, including, by the church attendance records Detective Klein subpoenaed, 3 of the 5 Sundays before Dorothy disappeared. He drove a dark-colored Ford pickup that 2 separate witnesses placed in the vicinity of 2nd Street on the evening of October 11th. Alcott was interviewed twice in November 1970. He was cooperative, detailed, and unrattled in a way that Klein noted in the file with particular care. He said he had driven past 2nd Street that evening on his way to a gas station on the far side of town. He couldn't remember precisely what time. He said he had known Dorothy Wainwright the way everyone in Madison knew her, to wave to pass on the street. Nothing more. There was no physical evidence connecting Raymond Alcott to the crime. The tire impressions from the service road had degraded beyond useful analysis. The Ford pickup was examined in early December. Nothing was found inside it that forensic methods of 1970 could connect to Dorothy. The case proceeded on circumstantial grounds into the spring of 1971, and then the summer, and then the fall, and then, with no charge possible, it did not proceed any further. The case was formally suspended in January 1972. Warren Klein, who retired from the Madison Police Department in 1981, told a reporter in 1989 that it was the only case he had ever worked that he was certain he knew the answer to and had not been able to prove. He said the name Raymond Alcott out loud in that interview, unprompted, and said it with a steadiness that made the reporter decide to leave it in the story. Raymond Alcott read the story. He told his neighbor it was slander. Gerald Wainwright drove from Indianapolis to Madison every October 11th. He would park on West Street, walk to the church, and then walk the route his sister would have taken home. Down past the fence line, past the back of the old grain company building, along Elm Street to the white house that had sold to a young couple in 1972 and been repainted twice since. He did not knock on the door. He simply walked the route, and then he drove home. He did this every year from 1971 until 2018, when his health made the drive impossible. He was 87 years old by then. He had never stopped writing to the Madison Police Department. He had never stopped writing to the Jefferson County Prosecutor's Office. In 48 years, he had sent 112 letters. He kept carbon copies of every one in a binder in his spare bedroom. Dorothy's former students, the ones who had been 9 and 10 years old in her 4th grade classroom in the late 1950s and 1960s, had grown into middle-aged and then elderly adults who still remembered the weekend library books. One of them, a woman named Patricia Shores, who had become a school teacher herself, kept a photograph of Dorothy's class from 1962 on her classroom wall for her entire career. She retired in 2009 and kept the photograph on her mantelpiece. She attended every public vigil. She wrote letters alongside Gerald. Raymond Alcott ran his garage on Michigan Street until 1998, when he sold it and retired. He was 62 years old. He attended church. He mowed his own lawn. He waved to people he knew on the street. He was, by all appearances, an old man living a quiet life in a town that had, for the most part, continued around him. The reward poster that the Jefferson County Prosecutor's Office had printed in 1971, Dorothy's school photograph, the word unsolved in large type, had been kept in the window of the Madison Courier's lobby for 22 years before it was moved to the archives. It was still in the archives in 2024. Every case on this channel comes from weeks of research, original records, court documents, interviews, and the hard work of finding the details that most people never hear about. If that matters to you, take a moment to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely helps us keep doing this. Now, back to Madison, because in 2023, something changed. Detective Sergeant Anita Morales of the Indiana State Police had been assigned the Wainwright file as part of a cold case initiative launched jointly by the ISP and the Jefferson County Prosecutor's Office in early 2023. The initiative prioritized pre-1980 homicides in which a named suspect had been identified but never charged, and in which biological evidence from the original investigation had been preserved. The Wainwright file contained 2 items that had been logged and archived in January 1971 and not re-examined since: a partial fingerprint lifted from the clasp of Dorothy Wainwright's handbag, and trace fiber material recovered from Dorothy's coat collar at the time of the autopsy. Both had been beyond the analytical reach of 1970s forensic science. By 2023, they were not. Detective Morales submitted the trace fiber material to the ISP Forensic Laboratory in February 2023. The analysis took 4 months. The fibers, synthetic dark green, consistent with a work jacket or mechanic's coverall, were not by themselves definitive. But they established a profile, and that profile, when entered into the combined ISP and FBI trace evidence database, returned a single manufacturer match to a line of industrial workwear distributed throughout Indiana and Ohio between 1965 and 1974. Raymond Alcott had operated an automotive garage for 28 years. His staff, and the garage's own photographic records, obtained by Detective Morales from the former garage building's current owner, who had found them in a storage room, showed Alcott in dark green mechanics coveralls in at least 14 photographs taken between 1967 and 1975. On a Tuesday morning in September 2023, Detective Morales sat in a conference room at the Jefferson County Courthouse with the prosecutor's office and laid out what she had. The Fibre evidence. The original witness placements of the dark, colored Ford pickup. The church attendance records. The 1989 interview in which Warren Klein had named Alcott directly. The intact partial fingerprint from the handbag clasp, which had been re-examined using modern automated fingerprint identification systems, and had returned a match. A match to Raymond Alcott's booking record from a 1968 public intoxication charge, the only time his fingerprints had ever been formally recorded. She said the name quietly, the way investigators say names they have been building toward for months. The prosecutor put down his pen. He looked at the file for a long moment. Then he said, "Get the warrant." Raymond Alcott was 87 years old when Detective Morales knocked on his door on the morning of November 7, 2023. He lived in the same house on Michigan Street that he had lived in since 1966. A low, well-maintained brick ranch house with a concrete driveway and a bird feeder in the front yard. He came to the door in a cardigan. He was thin and slow-moving, and his hands had the particular stiffness of a man who had spent decades working with them. He looked at Detective Morales and at the two uniformed officers behind her and said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "I suppose you'd better come in." He was arrested in his living room. The handcuffs were placed on him carefully, with acknowledgement of his age and condition. He was seated in the back of a police vehicle and driven through the streets of Madison, past the Grain Company building, past the church on West Street, past the White House on Elm Street where Dorothy Wainwright had kept her parents' garden, to the Jefferson County Jail. The news reached Madison within hours. By evening, the calls were coming into the Madison Courier from people who had lived in the town their whole lives and who said, in different words, the same thing they had always wondered. Some said they had always known. One woman, who had been a teenager in 1970 and had lived 5 houses down from Raymond Alcott for 60 years, told the reporter that she felt sick. Not just at what he had done, at how ordinary it had all looked from the outside. Every day for 53 years. Raymond Alcott was charged with the first-degree murder of Dorothy Wainwright. He appeared in Jefferson County Circuit Court in November 2023. At his initial hearing, his court-appointed attorney entered a not guilty plea. Alcott sat in the defendant's chair and looked at the floor. The trial was set for the following spring. It never reached a jury. In March 2024, Raymond Alcott changed his plea to guilty. His attorney read a brief statement. His client acknowledged his responsibility for the death of Dorothy Wainwright on the night of October 11, 1970. No other statement was offered. No explanation was given. No remorse was expressed in any language that the courtroom found adequate. Because there is no language adequate to 54 years. He was sentenced in April 2024 to the maximum term available under Indiana law for a defendant of his age and medical condition, 30 years. With the acknowledgement by the sentencing judge that this was, in practical terms, a life sentence. Judge Carolyn Marsh said one thing before she read the sentence that was reported in every account of the proceedings. She looked at Raymond Alcott and said, "Dorothy Wainwright went to church that night and came home to her garden the way she did every Sunday of her life. She never made it. You made sure of that. And you have lived your entire subsequent life in the same town where you did it, among the same people who loved her. This court finds that unconscionable." Alcott said nothing. He was led from the room. Gerald Wainwright had died in 2021, 3 years before the arrest. He was 90 years old. He never got to hear the name said aloud in a courtroom. He left behind 112 carbon-copied letters and a binder that his daughter, Dorothy's niece, brought to the sentencing hearing and held in her lap throughout. Patricia Shores, Dorothy's former student, was in the gallery. She was 72 years old. She had brought the photograph from her mantelpiece, the class of 1962, third row. Dorothy standing at the left side with her hand on a student's shoulder and a look of complete attention on her face. The look of someone who is entirely present in the room she's in. After the sentence was read, Patricia held the photograph in both hands for a long time without saying anything. Dorothy Wainwright stacked the hymnals on a Sunday evening in October and told the choir director she would see him on Wednesday. She walked out into the autumn air and turned south, the way she had walked home every Sunday for years. She was 39 years old. She had a house that had been her parents' house, and a garden she tended on her own, and a classroom full of children who borrowed her books over weekends, and a brother who drove down from Indianapolis twice a year, and a neighbor who noticed when her lights didn't come on. She had never done anything to Raymond Alcott. He had simply decided that her life was something he was entitled to take. And then he had lived across 3 streets from the house where she grew up, in the same town where she had taught those children, for 54 years, mowing his lawn, attending his church, waving at people he knew on the street, while her brother drove down every October 11th and walked her route alone. The hardest question this case leaves behind may not be about Raymond Alcott at all. It may be about what it means to live in proximity to an unsolved thing for half a century. To be a neighbor, a congregation member, a fellow resident of a small town, and to carry the unease of something unresolved without being able to name it. How many people in Madison sensed something about Raymond Alcott over those 54 years, in the way that you sometimes sense things about people you have known too long? And what do we owe to the dead when the living have moved on, and the evidence is old, and the case file has been sitting on a shelf for decades? I'd like to know what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and tell me, is a guilty plea 54 years later justice, or is it something smaller than justice that we call by that name because we don't have another one? Justice found Dorothy Wainwright after 54 years. It found her because a detective opened a box in 2023 and decided the fibers in a coat collar deserved another look. That is why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing regardless of how long it takes, subscribe, and there are more solved cold cases waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.